The diner was almost empty when the wind began to scream. Snow pressed against the glass, turning the world outside into a sheet of white. Emma Collins, her red apron dusted with flour, wiped down the counter one last time. She was ready to lock up, ready to face another long walk home through the frozen streets of Michigan. Then she saw him, an old man, hunched in the storm, his coat stiff with ice. He stood motionless outside the yellow door, his head bowed as if asking the snow for forgiveness. Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the light switch. Common sense whispered, "Close up and go home." But something warmer, older, and far more stubborn told her otherwise. She opened the door. A blast of cold rushed in, biting her cheeks. "Sir, please come inside before you freeze." Her voice sounded small against the wind. The old man didn't answer. He looked up, and for a brief moment she saw a flash of blue-gray eyes, weary but proud. Slowly he stepped over the threshold. Snow fell from his shoulders like old regrets. Emma shut the door quickly and guided him toward a booth near the heater. "Sit down. I'll get you something hot." She poured coffee into a chipped white mug and set it in front of him. The man wrapped both hands around it as though it were life itself. "You don't have to," he muttered. His voice was low, almost embarrassed. "I know," Emma said. "But it's freezing, and kindness doesn't cost that much." The corners of his mouth twitched, halfway between a smile and a memory. He wore a long gray overcoat lined with fur that had once been expensive. On the table beside him lay a pair of black leather gloves monogrammed with small gold initials. P.P. She didn't notice at first, but when she reached to wipe away the melting snow, the letters gleamed under the diner light. "You work late," he said after a long silence. "Double shift," she replied, shrugging. "Storm or not, bills don't wait." He nodded slowly, eyes on the window where flakes still danced in the streetlights. "I used to think storms could be planned around. Turns out they arrive whether you're ready or not." Emma smiled faintly. "That's life talking, not weather." He looked at her again, more carefully this time, as if trying to remember where he'd seen her before. "You remind me of someone?" he said. "Lucky her," she teased, but her voice softened. "You should rest. I'll lock up when it quiets down." Minutes stretched. The storm kept raging outside, the diner humming with that strange quiet only winter brings. The man's breathing slowed, steady and deep, like the ticking of an old clock. Emma turned off one of the neon lights to save power. The glow fell across his face, revealing lines carved by decades of decisions. When she came back with a blanket from the supply closet, he was already half asleep. She draped it over his shoulders. The faint smell of cedar and snow filled the booth. On the table, his wallet had slipped open just enough to show a photograph, a younger version of the man standing beside a gleaming Rolls-Royce, arm around a smiling woman. Emma closed it quietly, heart tightening. Maybe he was just another soul who'd once had everything and now had only silence. Maybe he'd done terrible things, or maybe he'd lost too much. But tonight, none of that mattered. She turned off the last light and whispered, "You're safe here." Outside, the storm howled, then softened as if even the wind respected a small act of mercy. The morning came reluctantly, like a curtain lifting after a long, heavy play. The snow had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in white silence. Pale sunlight spilled through the diner windows, glinting off the chrome napkin holders and the untouched salt shakers. Emma blinked against the brightness, rubbing her hands together for warmth. The heater hummed, and she remembered the old man. He was still there, sitting exactly where she'd left him, the blanket around his shoulders and the coffee mug empty. His head was bowed, his breath slow and even. For a moment she thought he was still asleep, but then he stirred and lifted his gaze. Those same gray eyes met hers clear now, sharp and unexpectedly gentle. "Morning," she said quietly. "You made it through the night." "So did you," he replied, voice rough but steady. He tried to stand, and Emma hurried over, steadying him by the arm. Beneath the layers of wool, she could feel how fragile he was, how age and cold had carved him into something thin and trembling. "Wait," she said. "You should eat before you go." He smiled faintly. "You already gave me more than I deserved." Emma shook her head and brought him a plate scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and a small cup of jam. She placed it in front of him and said, "You don't owe me anything, sir. It was just a cold night." The man studied her for a long time before answering. "That's exactly why it matters." He ate slowly, savoring each bite as if remembering the act of being cared for. When he finished, he stood and slipped his gloves back on. Emma noticed the initials again. PP and curiosity tugged at her. Before she could ask, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. "You've been kind to a stranger," he said. "Keep this. It's just a note, nothing more." She accepted it, surprised. "At least tell me your name." He hesitated at the door, sunlight haloing his silver hair. "Pierce," he said simply, and stepped outside. The name rang a bell somewhere in her memory, but she couldn't place it. By the time she ran to the window, he was gone, a figure swallowed by the white morning. The rest of the day drifted by in a quiet haze. Customers trickled in, stamping snow from their boots and ordering pancakes, coffee, warmth. Emma moved automatically, taking orders, refilling mugs, smiling out of habit. But her thoughts kept circling back to the old man, the way he'd looked at her, the weight behind his eyes. When she finally found a moment to breathe, she unfolded the napkin. Inside was a single line written in neat cursive, "Not every fortune is measured in dollars. Thank you for reminding me." The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned. She tucked it into her apron pocket, unsure why it made her chest ache. By evening the storm had melted into slush. The roads outside gleamed wet and gray, and the diner's neon sign flickered back to life. Emma was cleaning the counter when she heard a low, smooth hum, the sound of an engine too perfect to belong to anything ordinary. Headlights cut through the glass. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a stop right in front of the diner. She froze. The same logo PP glinted on the grill. The door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, brushing snow from his sleeves. His shoes barely touched the ground as he approached. "Miss Collins?" he asked politely, his voice crisp, professional. Emma hesitated, hand still on the counter. "Yes?" He handed her a small envelope, embossed with gold lettering. "Mr. Pierce asked me to deliver this personally." She opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note and a set of car keys, sleek, silver, unmistakably Rolls-Royce. "For your kindness during the storm. You reminded me that grace still exists in small places. This car is yours to keep or sell as you wish. Just remember, it's not payment, it's gratitude. HP." Emma's breath caught. She looked from the keys to the driver. "This must be a mistake." He shook his head gently. "Mr. Pierce doesn't make mistakes." Then he gave her a brief nod, turned, and disappeared back into the snow. The car remained idling, exhaust curling like ghostly ribbons into the air. Through the windshield, Emma could see the gleam of leather seats and the polished wood of the dashboard. The luxury of it seemed almost obscene against the chipped paint and neon buzz of her diner. She stood there for a long time, clutching the note. When she finally stepped outside, the cold hit her like a memory. The Rolls-Royce door opened automatically, soft interior lights glowing warm amber. She ran her fingertips along the edge of the door, the surface smooth as still water. "Guess you weren't just anyone," she murmured, half to herself. The engine purred as if answering her. Emma didn't drive it that night. She locked the doors, turned off the lights, and walked home through the quiet streets. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The world smelled clean, like endings and beginnings all at once. When she reached her small apartment, she pinned the napkin note beside a photo of her mother and whispered, "See, Mom? Some good things still happen." Outside, across the sleeping city, the Rolls-Royce gleamed under a streetlight, a silent monument to a night when a simple act of kindness had thawed the heart of a man who once thought he'd forgotten how to feel. The next morning, the city was still recovering from the storm. Plows carved narrow paths through the snow, and pale sunlight turned the frozen streets into rivers of silver. Emma arrived at the diner early, clutching a paper cup of coffee between her hands. The Rolls-Royce still sat outside, glinting quietly beside a mountain of snow, so out of place it looked like a dream someone had parked by mistake. She hadn't driven it home. She couldn't. The idea of sitting behind that wheel felt like trespassing on another world. Yet here it was, waiting, its black paint unblemished, its chrome emblem catching every shard of morning light. Inside, the regulars stared through the windows, whispering. "Who's the movie star?" one of the old truckers asked. Emma only smiled and said, "Must be lost." But her voice trembled, betraying her. She turned on the lights, wiped down the counter, and tried to ignore the feeling that her life had shifted in ways she couldn't see yet. Every sound, the hiss of the coffee machine, the bell above the door seemed sharper, more alive. When the mailman dropped off a stack of envelopes, she noticed one at the bottom, heavy cream paper, embossed with a gold crest identical to the one on the car key. Her name was written in looping ink, Miss Emma Collins. Her fingers shook as she opened it. "Dear Miss Collins, if you're reading this, I imagine the car startled you. I debated whether to send it, but last night you didn't hesitate to open your door to someone you thought was nobody. The truth is, that kind of grace can't be repaid, only honored. I built my company on precision, not compassion. Somewhere along the way I forgot the difference between profit and purpose. You reminded me. The car is not a gift, it's a promise that I intend to do better, starting today. If you ever find yourself in need of work beyond those diner walls, call this number. Tell them I sent you. Sincerely, Henry Pierce." Emma reread the signature, the loops and flourishes of the H and P, unmistakable. Henry Pierce, founder of Pierce Prestige Motors. The same name printed across billboards and magazines, the face that appeared in Forbes profiles, beside headlines about innovation and empire. She sank onto a stool, the letter trembling in her hands. The man she'd sheltered had been a billionaire, a man who could buy and sell this entire diner with the change in his pocket, and yet she'd seen none of that in him, only an old soul shivering in the snow, grateful for a cup of coffee and a blanket. For a long time she said nothing. The morning rush began, people filtering in with damp scarves and red noses, ordering pancakes and bacon like nothing in the world had changed. But to Emma, everything had. When her shift ended, she stood outside, watching the Rolls-Royce. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and melting snow. A small white envelope rested beneath the windshield wiper, another note. "You don't have to thank me. The world needs more doors like yours." No signature this time. Only the faint indent of handwriting pressed into the paper. Emma laughed softly, though her eyes burned. She opened the passenger door and slipped inside. The scent of polished leather and cedar filled the air. On the dashboard, tucked beneath the navigation screen, she found a second card. A business invitation engraved in gold. Pierce Foundation Launch Gala. Building kindness back into business. It was scheduled for that weekend. 2 nights later, she stood outside the glass tower of the Pierce Foundation in borrowed heels and a thrift store dress. The building rose into the clouds, every window gleaming. She felt impossibly small, but as she approached the entrance, a valet recognized the key she carried and opened the door for her with a respectful nod. Inside, chandeliers shimmered like captured stars. Men in tailored suits murmured over glasses of champagne. Women in silk gowns smiled politely. Emma felt the weight of their eyes, some curious, others dismissive. But when she spotted Henry Pierce across the room, standing tall in a simple black suit, speaking with quiet confidence, all the noise faded. He turned and saw her. The faintest smile crossed his face. He excused himself from a cluster of executives and walked toward her. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. His voice was steady now, without the tremor of the storm. "I wasn't sure I belonged here," she admitted. "You do," he said simply. "More than most of us." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by laughter and clinking glass. Then he gestured toward the stage. "We're starting something new tonight. I wanted you to be here when it begins." When the lights dimmed, Henry took the microphone. His words were calm but carried the weight of a confession. He spoke of greed disguised as ambition, of loneliness disguised as success, of how an act of kindness from a stranger had forced him to see the world again. "She opened a door for me," he said, his eyes finding Emma's in the crowd. "Not to escape the storm, but to remember what it means to be human." Applause rippled through the hall. Emma felt her throat tighten. For a fleeting second, she wished her mother were alive to see it, the girl who once worked double shifts now standing beneath chandeliers, her name whispered by people who'd never have noticed her before. After the speech, Henry approached her again. "That car," he said quietly, "isn't just for you. It's a reminder to me. Every time you drive it, know that somewhere, a man is trying to be worthy of the kindness you gave him." Emma smiled, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. "Then I'll take good care of it," she said. "And I'll keep the door open." He nodded. "That's all I could hope for." When she left the gala, the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement. The Rolls-Royce waited by the curb, its reflection stretching into the street. She paused before getting in, the cold air brushing her skin, and whispered into the night, "Thank you." End 14. The engine hummed softly as she drove away, not toward wealth, but toward something warmer. The quiet certainty that kindness, once given, never truly stops moving. The city had begun to thaw, but inside Emma, something deeper was changing quietly, steadily, like ice melting from the heart outward. The diner no longer felt like the whole world it once was. She still showed up on time, still poured coffee with a practiced smile, still laughed with the regulars about the weather and the endless snow. But when she looked out the fogged window and saw the reflection of the Rolls-Royce parked across the street, she felt as though two versions of herself were watching each other from opposite sides of the glass. One was the woman she'd always been, practical, grounded, living paycheck to paycheck. The other was someone new, a woman who had been seen, recognized, maybe even chosen. It wasn't about the car, it was about what it represented. Proof that kindness, quiet and ordinary as it was, still had the power to rewrite stories. One evening, as she was closing up, the door chimed. The bell's sound was soft but insistent, like a reminder. Henry Pierce stood in the doorway, snowflakes glinting on the shoulders of his long black coat. "Mr. Pierce?" she said, surprised. He smiled. "You still call me that. I think I owe you the right to use my first name." She hesitated, then smiled back. "Henry, then. What brings you here? I thought men like you had people who fetched your coffee." He glanced around the diner, his eyes softening. "I missed the taste of the real thing." He took a seat at the same booth where he'd once shivered through the storm. "And maybe," he added, "I wanted to see if the door was still open." "It always is," she said quietly, pouring him a cup. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the snow had turned to a thin drizzle, the world washed clean. The hum of the heater filled the spaces between their words. "I read about the foundation," she said finally. "You really did it." He nodded. "You gave me the idea. We're funding small businesses owned by service workers, waiters, janitors, single parents, the people who hold everything together but rarely get noticed." Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest. "That's beautiful, Henry." He looked at her then. Really looked not as a billionaire, not as a man used to being obeyed, but as someone searching for something human and familiar. "It's not enough," he said softly. "Not until I know I've made it right." "Made what right?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a photograph on the table. It showed a younger man, Henry, clean-shaven and confident, shaking hands with another executive in front of the Pierce Motors logo. A woman stood beside them, smiling, her eyes bright. "My wife," he said quietly. "She died 3 winters ago. Heart failure. I was in a board meeting when it happened." His voice cracked slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Since then, I built walls instead of bridges. That night in the storm, I thought I was ready to disappear. Then you opened the door." Emma's throat tightened. "You were never just a stranger, were you?" "I was," he said, "until you made me something else." The silence that followed was heavy but tender. Emma reached across the table, resting her hand over his. His fingers were cold, but they didn't pull away. "You don't owe me anything, Henry," she said softly. "Whatever kindness happened that night, it was never meant as a debt." "I know," he said, his eyes glistening. "That's why it saved me." After he left, the diner felt both emptier and lighter. Emma watched through the window as the Rolls-Royce disappeared into the night, its taillights glowing red against the wet asphalt. She exhaled slowly, the echo of their conversation lingering like the aftertaste of strong coffee. She didn't see him again for several weeks, but his presence seemed to ripple through her life in quiet ways. A bouquet of winter lilies arrived one morning with a note. Still grateful for the storm. A donation appeared in the diner's name to a local food bank. The foundation began spotlighting stories of workers across the city, their faces lit by the same kind of humble strength Emma carried every day. The world was still hard, of course. The bills still came, the snow still fell. But beneath it all, she felt something steady, a current of goodness moving unseen, as if the act of kindness that night had set off a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. Then, one gray afternoon, she received a call. "Miss Collins? This is Margaret Pierce, Henry's sister. I thought you should know Henry's been admitted to the hospital. Pneumonia." Emma's heart dropped. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and ran outside. At the hospital, she found him asleep, pale against the white sheets, oxygen tubes tracing delicate lines across his face. The rhythmic beep of the monitor filled the room like a ticking clock. She sat beside him, her hand brushing his. He stirred, opening his eyes. "Emma?" "Hey," she whispered. "You should have told me." "I didn't want you to worry." He smiled weakly. "Guess I'm not as invincible as I thought." "None of us are." They talked for hours about small things, big regrets, the strange coincidence of their meeting. When visiting hours ended, she stood to leave, but he caught her wrist gently. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything." "Keep that car," he whispered. "Don't hide it away. Drive it. Let it remind you, and everyone who sees it, that the smallest kindness can carry farther than any fortune." Tears blurred her vision. "I will," she said. He smiled faintly. "Then I can rest easy." 2 days later, Henry Pierce passed away in his sleep. At the funeral, city leaders and executives spoke about his achievements, his empire, his inventions, his wealth. But when Emma stepped forward, dressed simply in black, she said only one thing. "I didn't know Henry Pierce the billionaire. I only knew the man who once needed shelter from the storm. And I opened a door." The room fell silent. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle, endless, forgiving. Afterward, she walked to the parking lot. The Rolls-Royce waited there, sleek and silent under a thin coat of frost. She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound was soft, like a heartbeat. She drove slowly through the city, past strangers hurrying through the cold, past diners like hers, each glowing like a small refuge in the winter night. As she turned onto the long road home, she whispered to herself, "The door's still open." A ring, and somewhere above, where storms gather and melt, Henry Pierce might have smiled, because kindness, once set in motion, never stops traveling. Spring came late that year. The snow lingered in gutters and on rooftops long after the first flowers dared to bloom. Emma kept the diner running. Same hours, same routine, but everything about her felt different, lighter somehow, though she couldn't explain why. The Rolls-Royce stayed parked across the street most days, like a guardian made of glass and chrome, its reflection spilling gold under the morning sundae. Customers had stopped whispering about it. At first, they'd gawked, wondering how a woman like her ended up with a car like that. But after months, the rumor faded into something gentler respect. People started calling her the kindness lady. Truckers left bigger tips. Strangers smiled a little easier when they saw her. It wasn't fame. It was something quieter, purer. Kindness had become contagious. One afternoon, a young man came into the diner, college jacket, nervous eyes, trembling hands clutching a folded newspaper. "Are you Miss Collins?" he asked. She nodded. "That's me." He placed the paper on the counter. A headline read, "Pierce Foundation announces new program for working families." Beneath it was a photo of Henry Pierce, smiling beside a plaque engraved with Emma's name. "They said you inspired this," the young man said. "I got accepted into their scholarship program. I just wanted to thank you." Emma blinked, unsure what to say. That's wonderful. Congratulations." He grinned shyly. "My mom works 2 jobs. This means she can finally rest a little. I think Mr. Pierce would have liked that." Her throat tightened. "I think he would have too." When he left, she traced her name on the newspaper photo, feeling a soft ache bloom beneath her ribs. She'd never asked for recognition, but maybe that was the point. True kindness had a way of echoing beyond its origin, changing lives she'd never meet. A week later, a letter arrived without a return address. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, deliberate. To Emma Collins, "If you're reading this, I probably didn't get to say goodbye properly. Don't be sad about that. The storm that brought me to your door was the best mistake of my life. I spent years surrounded by power, thinking that made me strong. But it wasn't until a woman with tired eyes and a gentle heart offered me coffee that I learned what real strength looked like. Promise me you'll keep the diner. Promise you'll keep the door open. Henry." Tears blurred the words. She pressed the letter to her chest, the paper trembling like a heartbeat. That night, she stayed long after closing. Lights dimmed, coffee gone cold. Outside, rain began to fall soft, cleansing, spring rain. She opened the door and stood under the awning, letting the cool air touch her face. Somewhere, far above the city, the clouds shifted, and a faint glow spilled across the wet street. She could almost hear him saying it again. "You reminded me what decency looks like." A few months later, the foundation reached out. They wanted her to speak at a fundraising event. "Tell your story," they said. "People need to hear it." Emma hesitated. She wasn't a speaker, she was a waitress. But when she thought about the boy with the scholarship, about the tired faces that came into the diner every morning, she realized it wasn't her story, it was everyone's. So she agreed. The night of the event, she wore a simple navy dress, the same one she'd bought secondhand for Henry's gala. The auditorium was full executives, reporters, workers, families. The lights were bright, but she wasn't nervous. When she stepped up to the microphone, she didn't talk about the Rolls-Royce, or the money, or even Henry Pierce. She talked about the snow, about that night when compassion outweighed logic, when opening a door became an act of rebellion against indifference. She spoke of warmth in the middle of winter, of how the smallest kindness could change the course of a life, not just the receiver's, but the giver's too. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap, slow and steady, and soon the whole room followed. Emma stepped down from the stage, tears slipping free, but they weren't sad ones. Afterward, a woman in a tailored suit approached her. "I knew Henry," she said softly. "He would have been proud." Emma smiled. He already was. That night, as she drove home, the city glowed beneath the streetlights. The Rolls-Royce moved like liquid silver through the wet streets. When she reached the diner, she didn't park it out front. Instead, she pulled around back and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet tick of the cooling engine. Across the street, she could see the flicker of her neon sign "Open." The word glowed faintly through the mist. She thought about all the people who had stepped through that door since the storm. Lonely travelers, tired workers, strangers with stories written in their eyes. Some had stayed long enough to share a laugh, others just long enough for a cup of coffee, but each one had left a little warmth behind. Maybe that was what Henry had meant by keeping the door open. It wasn't about the diner itself, it was about staying soft in a hard world. She smiled at the thought and whispered into the still air, "Don't worry, Henry, the light's still on." In the weeks that followed, the diner became a kind of refuge. The foundation funded repairs, volunteers painted the walls, and Emma added a small brass plaque near the door. "This place stands because one night a stranger knocked. May we all answer when kindness calls." People started bringing their own stories of helping, of being helped. The plaque caught the light whenever someone walked in, and sometimes, when the sun hit it just right, the reflection shimmered across the floor like a promise. Emma would glance at it from behind the counter and feel a quiet certainty settle in her chest. The Rolls-Royce still gleamed outside, but she never saw it as wealth anymore. It was a memory, a symbol, a reminder carved from gratitude and snow. And every time the door chimed and another stranger stepped in from the cold, she'd look up with that same gentle smile, the one that had changed everything, and say, "Come in, you're safe here." Outside, the rain kept falling, soft and endless. Not a storm this time, but something even rarer, peace. Summer crept into the city like a quiet apology, the air soft and heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and blooming trees, and for the first time in years, Emma felt that the world was breathing in rhythm with her. The diner no longer carried the hollow echo of survival. It had become something else entirely, a place stitched together by stories, laughter, and the slow heartbeat of ordinary grace. Every morning, the bell above the door sang the same simple song, and with each chime she remembered how a single night of compassion had rewritten the map of her life. People came not just for food, but for the feeling that lingered in the air, that small, invisible warmth that turned strangers into witnesses of one another's humanity. Truckers on cross-country routes stopped to share news about their families. Students scribbled dreams on napkins. A quiet widow left folded paper cranes by the window every Friday. Emma never asked for explanations. She simply kept the coffee hot and the lights on, knowing that every act of kindness had its own silent echo. Sometimes, when the rush slowed and the sunlight pooled across the tiled floor, she would glance toward the brass plaque near the entrance and smile at the reflection of its inscription words that no longer belonged to her alone. The Rolls-Royce still waited outside, its black surface now kissed with dust and city pollen, no longer an emblem of wealth but a vessel of memory, a monument to the night that had thawed two lonely souls. She hadn't driven it in weeks, preferring the old bus route that passed through neighborhoods painted with murals of hope and second chances, as if the world itself was reminding her to stay close to the ground. Letters continued to arrive from the Pierce Foundation, filled with updates about new programs and scholarships, each envelope like a heartbeat from Henry's legacy. One afternoon, she opened a package to find a small framed photograph of a new community center. Its doors painted the same warm amber as the diner's, its name etched in simple silver letters. The Open Door Project. Beneath it was a handwritten note from one of the directors. He said this place began with you. Emma held the frame against her chest, eyes burning, realizing that the storm had never truly ended. It had simply changed shape, becoming the quiet rain that nourished everything it once threatened to destroy. As the days stretched longer, she began to see her own reflection differently, not as the tired waitress counting tips under fluorescent light, but as someone who had unknowingly become part of a greater circle of giving. People often thanked her, sometimes with words, sometimes with gestures, but she always deflected the praise with the same gentle refrain. It wasn't me, it was the moment. She believed that deeply, that life offered crossroads disguised as inconveniences, and that goodness began the instant one chose to stop walking past another person's need. One humid evening, when the sky glowed lavender and the air trembled with the hum of cicadas, Emma closed early and walked to the pier. The water shimmered beneath a horizon streaked with gold, and she thought about Henry, about his tired eyes, his quiet smile, and the way he had said, "You reminded me what decency looks like." The memory no longer hurt. It pulsed softly inside her, like a steady light she could return to whenever the world felt too cold. She sat on a bench, the smell of salt and rust mingling in the air, and let herself breathe, long and unhurried, as if each breath was a conversation between her and the man who had taught her that redemption was not found in wealth, but in being seen. When she returned home, the night had deepened into that particular shade of blue that feels like forgiveness. She passed the diner, its windows glowing softly, the brass plaque glinting under the streetlight, and felt a surge of quiet pride that had nothing to do with ownership. Inside, the tables were empty, The chairs turned upside down, yet the room seemed alive, holding every laugh, every tear, every act of grace that had ever passed through its door. She realized then that she had built something sacred without meaning to a sanctuary for anyone weary of the world's indifference. As she reached for the keys to lock up, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain and the whisper of thunder in the distance. She smiled at the sound, remembering the first storm and the shivering stranger who had changed everything. The storm had once been a test, but now it felt like a companion, a reminder that warmth meant nothing without cold to measure it against. She looked through the glass, where her reflection merged with the faint outline of the Rolls-Royce parked outside, and whispered into the night, "You can rest now, Henry. The door's still open." The wind brushed against the windows like a sigh, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a silhouette in the driver's seat, a calm figure bathed in moonlight, smiling through the years that separated them. Then it was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the city and the soft rhythm of her own heartbeat. Emma turned off the lights, stepped into the warm night air, and walked home slowly, each step echoing with the truth that had carried her through every season, that the smallest kindness, once released into the world, never fades, but travels endlessly from soul to soul, finding its way back when you least expect it. Autumn arrived like a soft confession, brushing the city with golden rust, and Emma found herself walking slower, breathing deeper, as if each falling leaf carried a secret meant only for her. The air held that bittersweet scent of endings, disguised as renewal, and she began to understand that change was not something to fear, but something to welcome, like a long-delayed letter. The diner thrived quietly beneath the amber trees, its windows fogged with warmth, the smell of cinnamon and coffee weaving together into a hymn of comfort that called strangers in from the chill. Every morning she would lift the blinds and watch the first light spill across the counter, remembering how once she had believed the world could only take from her, and now it seemed to give in ways she could barely contain. Letters still arrived from across the country, students who had finished their degrees, single parents who had rebuilt their lives, volunteers who credited the Open Door Project for helping them remember their worth. And though each story felt like a gift, she never forgot the storm that had begun it all. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the narrow street, she would pause mid-pour, listening for something deeper beneath the sound, something that felt like gratitude moving through the air. The Rolls-Royce remained parked beneath the old maple tree, its once flawless surface now traced with faint scratches from children's bicycles and drifting branches, and she loved it more for those imperfections, as if time itself had signed its name across the paint. One afternoon, while she was stacking cups behind the counter, a woman in her 40s entered the diner, her coat elegant, yet her eyes carrying the same weary kindness Emma recognized from the mirror. "You must be Miss Collins," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly as she introduced herself as Margaret Pierce, Henry's sister. They sat together by the window, two women bound by one man's memory, and as Margaret spoke about how Henry had spent his final months designing charitable programs instead of profit charts, Emma realized that the storm had not just changed one life, but an entire family's understanding of legacy. Margaret reached into her purse and placed a small box on the table. Inside was a pocket watch engraved with Henry's initials and the words, "For the one who kept the door open." Emma closed her hand around it, feeling the delicate weight of time and gratitude resting against her skin, and for a long while neither of them spoke, because silence sometimes said everything that words could not. As October deepened, the diner's windows glowed against the early dusk, drawing travelers from highways slick with rain, and Emma began hosting story nights, where anyone could share moments of compassion they had witnessed or received. The room would fill with laughter, tears, and the low hum of belonging, the kind that doesn't demand attention but offers understanding. Each story stitched another piece into the invisible quilt of kindness that now covered her life, and she began to sense Henry's presence in every soft smile and gentle act that unfolded within those walls. One evening, a young woman stood up and said she had once been homeless during a snowstorm, but had found refuge in a small diner where the waitress refused payment. The crowd clapped, and Emma felt her breath catch, realizing that kindness, when genuine, always circles back in ways you never expect. Outside, the city transformed with the season. Parks turned into canvases of amber, the river shimmered like molten copper, and children kicked leaves into the air, with the joy of those too young to fear impermanence. Emma walked home each night beneath that cascade of color, her steps slow and deliberate, her thoughts lingering on the delicate balance between memory and motion. She had learned that grief does not end when tears dry. It softens, becomes music, becomes the quiet that fills a room after laughter fades. Henry's absence was no longer an ache, but a presence steady, watchful, threaded through the rhythm of her days. One evening, after locking up, she found herself standing beside the Rolls-Royce, the street lamps reflecting on its curved hood like starlight caught in metal. She traced her fingertips along the emblem and whispered a thank you to the man who had once sat there, shivering and lost, unaware that salvation would come disguised as a waitress with tired hands and a warm heart. She slipped the pocket watch from her coat and clicked it open. Its steady ticking sounded like rain on a window pane, patient and eternal. For a moment she imagined Henry walking beside her down the quiet street, his coat flapping softly, his voice carrying that familiar mix of irony and warmth as he said, "You see, Emma, even storms can bloom." When she reached home, the night sky was clear, the kind of endless blue-black that makes every city light look like a small, deliberate act of defiance. She stood by her window, watching the horizon pulse with motion, and she thought of all the people she had met: the boy with the scholarship, the widow with the paper cranes, the countless faces that had passed through her door carrying their own private winters. It struck her then that kindness was not a single gesture frozen in memory, but a current, wide and unseen, that moved through every life it touched, gathering strength as it went. As the clock ticked past midnight, she whispered into the quiet, "The door's still open, Henry. It always will be." And she knew that somewhere, perhaps in the echo between heartbeats or the pause between falling leaves, the world had heard her. The wind rose gently, rattling the window pane, and she imagined it carrying her words through the sleeping city, past the shining towers and dim alleys, over rivers and fields, until they reached every soul still waiting for warmth. Then she turned off the light, let the darkness settle around her like a promise kept, and slept with a peace that felt not like an ending, but a continuation of everything she and Henry had begun. Winter returned quietly, without thunder or drama, just the slow breath of wind against the windows and the delicate whisper of snow settling over the city like a forgotten lullaby. The world seemed softer now, muted under its white quilt, and Emma moved through it with the calm rhythm of someone who had made peace with both the storms and the silences. The diner glowed like a small lantern in the gray morning light, its windows fogged from the warmth within, and every person who stepped through its door carried a little bit of the outside frost that melted away in her presence. The years had not made her rich, not in any way that bankers could measure, yet every corner of that place was filled with the invisible currency of gratitude, laughter, and redemption. Each morning began the same way, with the steady hiss of the coffee machine, the quiet hum of the neon sign, and the familiar creak of the old wooden stool by the counter. Emma would watch the reflection of the Rolls-Royce across the street, its once gleaming surface now powdered with snow, and feel a tenderness that reached beyond words. She had stopped seeing it as a gift or a symbol. Now it was simply a reminder that some acts of grace remain alive long after the people who inspired them are gone. Customers often asked about the car, curious about its story, and she would smile and tell them only that it belonged to a friend who taught her that wealth is measured by the warmth you leave behind. Those who understood would nod quietly, and those who didn't would smile politely. But either way, the truth settled between them like steam rising from a mug on a cold morning. The diner had become a kind of pilgrimage site for kindness. People left letters, drawings, and folded bills tucked under plates for strangers who might need them more. Emma never organized it, never announced it. Yet somehow everyone knew the rule: what was given there stayed in motion, passing from one open hand to another like light passing through glass. She had learned that generosity, when allowed to flow freely, carried a rhythm too steady to ever fade, and sometimes she thought she could hear it humming beneath the clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of conversation. One afternoon, as the snow fell thick and soundless outside, a boy of no more than 8 entered the diner holding a wrinkled envelope. His coat was too thin, his cheeks flushed red from the cold, and his eyes bright with both fear and determination. "Are you Miss Collins?" he asked, clutching the envelope with trembling fingers. When she nodded, he placed it on the counter and said, "My mom said to give this to you. She said you'd know what to do." Then, before she could ask, he ran back out into the snow, his footprints vanishing behind him. Inside the envelope was a short note written in shaky handwriting. "I lost my job, but I remember your story from the newspaper. If you can, please give this meal to someone who needs it more than me." Emma stared at the $10 bill enclosed, her chest tightening with that familiar ache that was both joy and sorrow. She folded the note carefully and pinned it to the corkboard near the register, right beside Henry's old napkin message. And for the rest of the day, every customer who saw it seemed to speak softer, move gentler, tip a little more. The boy never returned, but in the weeks that followed, strangers began leaving more envelopes just like it, and the board filled until it looked like a collage of small, beating hearts. As the winter deepened, Emma found herself waking earlier, drawn to the quiet hours before dawn when the streets still slept beneath their silver veil. She would make a pot of coffee, step outside, and watch her breath rise into the crisp air, feeling the world pause in that fragile space between darkness and light. In those moments, she often thought of Henry, his voice, his laugh, his letter, and imagined him walking beside her through the snow, their footprints weaving together in a pattern only the wind could understand. She didn't speak to him anymore. She didn't have to. His memory lived in the rhythm of the diner, in the kindness of strangers, in the stillness that followed every storm. One evening, as she was closing up, the power flickered, and for a heartbeat, the diner plunged into darkness. The sudden quiet startled her, but then she saw it, the faint glow of the streetlights reflecting off the snow, spilling through the window in long ribbons of gold. In that gentle light, the brass plaque by the door shimmered as if alive, and she felt a wave of calm wash over her. She walked to the entrance, ran her hand across the words engraved there, and whispered, "Still open." The lights flickered back on a moment later, but the feeling remained, the sense that the world was listening, that somewhere beyond the reach of sight, Henry's spirit nodded in approval. Weeks passed, and the snow began to thin, revealing the dark earth beneath, the first shy promise of another spring. Emma looked older now, the kind of older that carries peace instead of fatigue, and her smile had grown slower but deeper, as though every word she spoke carried the weight of all the silences she had lived through. The people who came to the diner often remarked that something about the place felt different, as if time itself slowed inside its walls, allowing them to remember the gentler parts of themselves they had forgotten outside. She would laugh softly at that and say it wasn't the place that worked the magic, it was the people who brought their hearts through the door. On the last snowy night of the season, she stepped outside and looked at the Rolls-Royce one more time, its polished hood reflecting the streetlight like a mirror to another world. She thought about how it had once symbolized power, then loss, then gratitude, and now simply existence, the quiet endurance of things that survive love. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from a passing couple, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the world blur into sensation, the taste of cold air, the hum of the city, the pulse of her own steady heart. She realized then that redemption was not something you achieved. It was something you lived, one open door at a time, until kindness became the language your soul spoke without effort. She smiled at the thought, turned back toward the diner's golden glow, and whispered into the falling snow, "Come in. You're safe here." Then she walked inside, and behind her the wind carried her words out into the world, scattering them like seeds across the sleeping city. Spring unfolded slowly that year, not in sudden bursts of color, but in patient breaths of green edging through the gray, And Emma felt as though the world itself was teaching her how to bloom again without forgetting the quiet that had come before. The snow melted into the soil, the sidewalks shimmered with rain, and every drop sliding down the diner's window seemed to trace the story she had been living, one that began in a storm and had never truly stopped moving. The mornings were gentle now. Sunlight slipped through the blinds like soft forgiveness, and Emma, with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, would watch the city wake with the same tenderness she once reserved for strangers. Each day arrived not as a repetition but as a continuation, and she had learned to welcome the ordinary as though it were sacred. The Rolls-Royce still waited across the street, its polished frame now catching the reflection of cherry blossoms drifting through the air like fragments of old promises, and Emma thought it looked less like a luxury and more like a relic of gratitude preserved in metal and glass. Sometimes, children passing by would press their faces against the window, pointing and giggling, their breath fogging the surface, and she would wave from behind the counter, amused by how innocence always found wonder in what adults had learned to overlook. The car had become part of the neighborhood's rhythm, familiar yet mysterious, its story whispered by locals with affection instead of envy, a symbol not of wealth, but of what happens when compassion refuses to fade. Inside, the diner pulsed with quiet life. People came and went like tides, leaving behind fragments of their stories in the form of laughter, confessions, and folded notes tucked under sugar jars. Emma listened when she could, offering nods, smiles, and the occasional word of comfort, understanding now that listening was its own form of kindness. There was a grace in simply being there, in holding space for others without trying to fix what wasn't hers to mend. Over time, the walls seemed to absorb all those voices until even the silence between customers felt alive with echoes of hope. One morning, a familiar voice startled her from her thoughts. "You still make the best coffee in the city," it said, and she turned to see Margaret Pierce standing in the doorway, her coat damp from the drizzle, her expression a blend of exhaustion and relief. They hugged like old friends who had outlived grief together, and when they sat by the window, Margaret's eyes glistened with news too tender to speak immediately. "The foundation's expanding," she said finally, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "We're opening branches overseas, one in London, one in Seoul. We've named the initiative the Open Door Global. Henry's vision has become something larger than even he imagined." "Oh, when?" Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of awe that was almost disbelief. "He'd be proud," she said softly. Margaret smiled, her gaze distant but steady. "He'd say it was all you, that you opened the first door." Emma shook her head, laughing quietly, because she had long stopped believing in ownership of kindness. "It was a river, not a monument. Something that moved through you but never belonged to you." They talked for hours, reminiscing about Henry's laughter, his stubborn idealism, his impossible hope, until the afternoon light shifted and painted the diner walls gold. When Margaret finally stood to leave, she placed an envelope on the table. "For you," she said. "A token, not of payment, but of connection." Inside the envelope was a plane ticket and a letter. "We're dedicating the London branch in your name," it read. "Come see what you began." Emma stared at the ticket for a long time that night, the thought of leaving both thrilling and terrifying. The diner had been her anchor, her confessional, her home, yet something deep within her stirred a quiet call to witness the ripples of her one small act across oceans she'd never seen. When the day came, she locked the diner early, leaving a handwritten note on the door that simply read, "Back soon, keep the coffee warm." The neighborhood gathered outside to wish her well, their faces glowing with pride, and as she slid into the Rolls-Royce for what would likely be its final journey under her care, she felt Henry's presence beside her, calm and steady as ever. The engine purred, smooth and confident, and as the car moved through streets lined with blooming dogwoods, she realized she was no longer driving toward an ending, but toward continuation. The flight to London was long, filled with memories rather than miles, and when she arrived, the air carried the same chill she remembered from that first storm, though now it felt gentler, less like a warning, and more like an embrace. The foundation's new building stood near the Thames, its doors painted the same amber hue as her diner's, and above them a small brass plaque gleamed with familiar words. "May we all answer when kindness calls." Emma touched the inscription, smiling through tears, understanding that this was not her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever opened a door, offered a hand, or seen humanity where others saw inconvenience. At the dedication ceremony, she was asked to speak, and as she stepped up to the podium, the soft drizzle outside tapped against the windows like applause from the heavens. She didn't prepare a speech. She simply spoke from the place where gratitude and memory met. "Kindness," she said, her voice steady but tender, "isn't something you give once. It's a language we're all still learning to speak, and when one person remembers how, the world listens." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that hums with understanding, and in that moment she felt Henry beside her again, his presence woven into the breath of everyone there. When it was over, she stood by the window overlooking the river, the city lights flickering like 1,000 small souls, moving through the mist, and thought of the diner across the ocean, the bell above the door, the warmth of the stove, the echo of laughter. She imagined someone new stepping inside, carrying their own storm, and being met with the same simple invitation. "Come in, you're safe here." A tear slipped down her cheek, not of sorrow but of wholeness, because she knew now that kindness had no address. It traveled through hearts like light through glass, leaving everything it touched a little brighter. As she turned from the window, she whispered into the London night, "The door's still open, Henry." And the wind, soft and endless, seemed to whisper back, "It always will be." End quote. Evening descended upon London like a gentle exhale, folding the city into shadows of amber and silver, and as Emma stepped out of the Pierce Foundation's new building, the air smelled of wet stone and lilac, carrying the same quiet promise that had followed her since the first storm years ago. The streetlights flickered against the drizzle, blurring the edges of the world until every reflection looked like a memory, and she walked slowly along the riverside, her heels clicking in soft rhythm with the water's distant hum. The plaque above the entrance gleamed faintly in the mist. "May we all answer when kindness calls." And she thought of Henry, of the night his weary figure had appeared through the snow, and how something as fragile as mercy had managed to outlive them both. Her journey to London had felt like traveling backward through time. Each cloud, each mile above the Atlantic seemed to carry echoes of everything she had once believed impossible. The Foundation's directors had welcomed her with warmth and reverence, treating her like a symbol, but Emma knew she was never meant to be one. She was only a witness, a small thread in a tapestry that now spanned continents, woven from the choices of countless hands she would never meet. Yet as she stood beside the Thames, watching the reflections ripple, she realized that perhaps being a witness was enough, that maybe all any person could do was notice the beauty that kindness left behind and carry it forward, quietly, faithfully, into the next ordinary day. She crossed the bridge, her coat gathered tight against the wind, and in the distance the cathedral bells began to toll, their echoes spilling across the rooftops like liquid gold. Every chime reminded her of the bell above the diner's door back home, of the way it had sung each time someone sought refuge from the cold, and she smiled at the thought that sound could travel farther than even memory. Somewhere across the ocean, the bell was still ringing, announcing another stranger's arrival, another moment of grace disguised as coincidence, another story beginning exactly where hers had once started. That night, she stayed in a small inn overlooking the river, the kind of place with creaking floors and soft lamps that painted halos on the wallpaper. The room smelled faintly of tea and rain, and she sat by the window writing a letter she knew she would never send. "Dear Henry," she began, "I saw what you built, and it's still growing. You were right. Storms don't destroy. They reveal. Every life that's touched by this work carries a spark of what we began, and I can see it in their eyes, in their voices, in the way they speak about hope as if it's something they can finally hold." She paused, the pen trembling slightly between her fingers, then continued, I think I finally understand what you meant when you said kindness doesn't need witnesses, it just needs faith." When she finished, she folded the page neatly and tucked it into her pocket, not to mail but to keep, as if the act of writing it had already delivered it to wherever he was. Days passed in quiet wonder. She visited classrooms funded by the foundation, listened to teachers speak about compassion as curriculum, and watched children paint murals of open doors and golden light. Each brushstroke felt like an answer to the ache that had once lived in her chest, the ache of believing she was small and the world too large to change. She realized now that change never arrived as thunder. It came softly, through patience, through persistence, through hearts willing to open despite the cold. And every smile she saw carried that truth back to her like sunlight refracted through 100 windows. One evening, she was invited to a private dinner for the board, a gathering held inside an old hall lined with portraits of founders and benefactors. Her seat card read Emma Collins, honorary chair, and for a moment she hesitated before sitting, because the title felt heavier than she could carry. But when the conversation turned to future projects and someone asked her what she thought the foundation's next step should be, she spoke simply and clearly, her voice low but unwavering. "Keep it human," she said. "Don't let kindness become a brand. Let it stay messy, unpredictable, alive. Let it belong to everyone." The room grew still for a moment, and she saw heads nodding, eyes softening, as if her words had reminded them that goodness doesn't need polish, it just needs to be real. After the dinner, she walked alone through the quiet streets, the city breathing around her like a living thing. She passed shop windows filled with pastries, books, and bouquets of wildflowers, their colors vivid against the night, and thought about how every ordinary thing carried a trace of care. She thought of her mother's hands folding napkins in the diner, of Henry's rough voice saying thank you, of the nameless boy who'd brought her that crumpled envelope on a snowy afternoon. Each of them had been a single note in the long symphony of kindness, and she had been lucky enough to hear it all the way through. When she reached the river again, the moon had risen high, its reflection breaking across the ripples like scattered pearls. She stood there, the wind tugging gently at her hair, and whispered to the water. "The door's still open." The words floated out into the night, dissolving into mist, yet she could almost hear an answer, faint but certain, as if carried on the current itself. She stayed until the chill bit at her fingers, then turned back toward the inn, her steps slow and deliberate, each one a quiet prayer of gratitude. Tomorrow she would fly home, return to the diner, the brass plaque, the bell, and the people who filled that small corner of the world with warmth. She would tell them that the kindness born in their town now stretched across oceans, that their stories had become bridges, that even the smallest acts could echo forever if they were born from love. As she walked beneath the final streetlight, the glow haloing her like dawn breaking through the night, she realized that her story had never really belonged to her or to Henry. It belonged to the countless souls who believed that goodness could outlast grief. And in that understanding she felt lighter than air, her heart steady and full, carrying within it the unshakable truth that redemption was never a destination, but a journey made of open doors, patient hearts, and storms that teach you how to see the light. The morning she returned to America, the sky stretched pale and endless above the tarmac, the color of soft porcelain before dawn, and Emma felt a familiar calm settling over her as the plane descended through layers of light that looked like folded silk. The city below glimmered faintly, half asleep, half waiting, and she wondered if the diner's bell would still sound the same after all this time, that quiet, metallic song that had once marked the beginning of everything. When the wheels touched the runway, she exhaled slowly, realizing that home was not a single place but the invisible thread connecting all the moments when she had chosen compassion over comfort. Every act of kindness she had witnessed across the ocean seemed to hum inside her chest like a secret vow renewed with each breath she took. At customs, the officer smiled at her passport and said, "Welcome home, Miss Collins." And the words carried more weight than he could have known, echoing with every version of herself she had left, scattered across time. The drive back to her town felt like walking through a memory that had learned how to breathe again. The trees stood taller, the storefronts brighter, and yet everything carried a gentleness that seemed to recognize her, as if the whole world had been keeping her place while she was gone. The diner appeared at the corner of Main Street just as the sun broke through the clouds, washing the glass in a shimmer of gold, and for a heartbeat, she saw her younger self inside, apron tied, eyes tired, unaware that a single open door would change the course of so many lives. When she stepped inside, the familiar warmth embraced her instantly, the smell of coffee, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of plates like a heartbeat she had missed without realizing it. The regulars looked up, faces breaking into smiles, and someone called, "She's back!" The sound rippled through the room like sunlight across water. A small crowd formed around her, hugs and laughter mingling with questions about her trip, and she answered each one softly, her voice steady but filled with wonder, telling them about the foundation, the children, the new centers, rising like small beacons across continents. "It all started here," she said, gesturing toward the door, her eyes shining, "and it's still growing." When the morning rush faded and the diner quieted again, Emma poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, the same booth where Henry had once rested his weary hands against the warmth of a mug. The Rolls-Royce was still parked across the street, polished and waiting, though she rarely drove it now. It had become more like a monument than a vehicle, a promise kept in chrome and silence. She sipped slowly, the steam curling around her face, and thought about how time never really healed things. It simply folded them into us, turning pain into understanding and memory into guidance. She reached into her bag and pulled out the pocket watch Margaret had given her, the metal cool against her skin, and when she clicked it open, the ticking sounded like a heartbeat steadying itself after a long journey. As she sat there, a young woman entered the diner, her hair damp from rain, her coat threadbare, her eyes filled with the same exhaustion Emma had once known too well. She hesitated near the door, uncertain if she belonged, and Emma rose immediately, smiling as she said, "Come in, sweetheart, you look frozen." The girl blinked in surprise, then smiled shyly, murmuring her thanks as she slid into a booth. Emma brought her coffee and a plate of warm toast, refusing her attempt to pay, and when the girl asked why, she simply said, "Someone once did the same for me." Their eyes met for a moment that felt like the world turning quietly on its axis, and Emma knew that kindness had just found another home to live in. Days passed into weeks, and the diner returned to its familiar rhythm, yet beneath its routine pulsed something deeper, a sense of continuation, of a legacy quietly perpetuating itself through small, ordinary moments. Emma noticed how customers treated each other more gently now, how laughter lingered longer, how silence no longer felt empty but full of trust. The brass plaque by the door gleamed brighter than ever, polished daily by hands she didn't even know, and one evening, as the last customers left, she traced its engraved words once more. "This place stands because one night a stranger knocked. May we all answer when kindness calls." She whispered them aloud, the syllables carrying the same sacred weight as prayer. Outside, dusk descended in soft shades of rose and blue, and the first stars began to appear above the rooftops. Emma stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing her face, and looked across the street at the Rolls-Royce. The reflection of the diner lights shimmered on its hood like a candle burning behind glass, and for a moment she imagined Henry sitting there again, his expression calm, his presence steady, as if time itself had bent just enough to let him watch what his kindness had become. "You did it, Henry," she whispered. "You kept the door open." The wind stirred gently, lifting her hair, and though no voice replied, she felt the answer in her bones, the quiet assurance that he was everywhere, in every open door, every act of grace, every person who chose compassion instead of fear. That night, after locking up, she walked home through the calm streets, her footsteps echoing softly against the pavement slick with rain. The moon hung low, veiled in silver clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and renewal. She thought about how many people might be standing in storms at that very moment, waiting for someone to open a door, and she felt a fierce tenderness for them, all the strangers, the wanderers, the ones who hadn't yet learned that kindness was waiting just beyond fear. "We never really save each other," she thought. "We just remind one another how to be human." When she reached her small apartment, she opened the window and let the cool breeze drift through, carrying with it the sound of the city, breathing 1,000 small lives intersecting, colliding, forgiving. On her nightstand, beside the folded letter to Henry she would never send, sat the pocket watch still ticking faithfully. She listened for a long while, the rhythm of it syncing with her pulse, until the two became indistinguishable, the sound of time and the sound of gratitude merging into one. Before turning off the light, she whispered the same words she had said on that first night long ago, the words that had changed everything. "Come in. You're safe here." Then she closed her eyes, and the city outside seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if bowing to the quiet endurance of kindness that never asked for reward, but always somehow found its way home. Morning rose gently over the town, the kind of golden light that made even cracked sidewalks and worn rooftops seem touched by grace, and Emma stood by the diner's window watching the first beams slip across the empty street like quiet blessings. The air was cool and sweet, the faint scent of brewed coffee mingling with the smell of rain-soaked pavement, and everything felt still in that way only small towns can be before the world wakes fully. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind against the glass, and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the pocket watch resting near her hand, a melody of ordinary life that sounded, to her, like the hymn of survival. Years had folded softly into one another, smoothing the sharp edges of memory until they gleamed like sea glass, and she had learned that peace was not the absence of pain, but the quiet understanding of it. The diner had become a living story now. People came not just to eat, but to breathe, to remember that goodness could still exist without announcement or applause. Photographs lined one wall, smiling families, foundation volunteers, children standing before the new centers overseas, and beneath each frame, a small engraved plate read, "The Open Door Project. Begun by a storm, sustained by kindness." Emma often paused to look at them, tracing the images with her fingertips as if counting blessings by touch alone, feeling the invisible threads that connected her small act to so many unseen hearts around the world. Outside, the first customers began to arrive, their laughter and footsteps mingling with the morning breeze, and she greeted each one by name, her voice warm with the softness that comes from having lived long enough to know what truly matters. A young woman helped her carry out a new brass pot for the coffee, the girl's wrist bearing the foundation's logo in the shape of a door left slightly open, and Emma smiled because she knew the work would continue long after she was gone. There was no sadness in that thought, only relief, a deep exhale of gratitude for the way life renews itself through others. When the rush faded, and sunlight streamed fully through the diner's windows, she sat once more by the same booth where everything had begun. Across the street, the Rolls-Royce waited beneath the maple tree, its chrome glint softened by dust and time, and she found beauty in its imperfection, as though the car itself had aged alongside her. She closed her eyes and remembered that first night, the scream of the wind, the trembling hands of the man at her door, the soft crackle of the heater as warmth crept back into the room. That memory no longer carried sorrow. It pulsed with quiet reverence, a reminder that love, in its simplest form, is just the courage to see someone and stay. A hush settled over the diner then, a peace so complete it felt almost sacred, and Emma whispered the words that had guided her through decades of seasons and storms. Kindness doesn't end, it moves. She smiled at the truth of it, at the realization that every life she had touched would go on touching others, weaving a tapestry too vast for her to ever see. The pocket watch ticked steadily beside her, marking not the passing of time but its continuation, and as the light grew brighter, spilling across her face, she lifted her gaze toward the open door. Outside, a child's laughter rang out, pure and boundless, echoing down the street like the sound of hope being born again, and she felt Henry's presence in that laughter in the sunlight, in the dust motes floating through the diner's air, in the warmth that would remain long after her own hands grew still. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, balanced perfectly between memory and promise, and she knew that she had kept her vow. The door was still open. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac and rain, and she whispered one final time, "You can rest now, Henry. We're all home." Then she looked toward the window, where the morning light met the golden lettering of the plaque, and her reflection smiled back a small, steady light framed in amber, eternal as compassion itself. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the day, as always, began again.